Zdrasita, hello. My name is Victor, or Mr. Burnaby, and I will be your teacher for this afternoon. So first, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I am an American. I'm from the United States of America, and I'm an English teacher. I've taught on 3 continents. I've taught in Oceania, in Asia, in Iraq, and in North America, in my home state of Connecticut. So today we're going to be talking about a little bit of review. If you are level B1 or level B2, you probably are pretty confident with the past simple in English. And you might even know about the present perfect in English. We use these 2 things to tell about things that we have done. Okay? So today we're going to talk about travel, one of my favorite things to do. Using these 2 tenses, and then we're going to introduce the past perfect tense. So first, I want to show you this map behind me. This is a map of the world, as you can see, and everywhere where there's a little pin is a place that I've been, a place that I have traveled to, okay? So you'll notice that when I say I have traveled or I have been, that's using the present perfect, okay? When we tell someone about a trip, we say, I went somewhere. Last week, I went to New York. Or last year, I traveled to Africa. Or 2 months ago, I flew or drove to Mexico, okay? So that's our past simple. And our example there is, I went to Bender yesterday. You could also say, yesterday I went to Bender. It means the exact same thing. In English, that putting the place doesn't really matter so much where you put it, okay? But it should probably be at the end or in the beginning, okay? So that's our past simple. We use that when we want to talk about a specific or an exact time that we went to a certain place. We use present perfect to talk about life experiences. And we use present perfect when we don't want to say when we did that thing or when we went to a certain place, okay? So if I say, I have been to Bender, I have been to Bender, that could be, I went there last week. That could be, I went there last month. That could be, I went there when I was 2 years old and I have not gone back, okay? It doesn't say when, so we don't know. We don't know when I went to Bender, okay? So that's when we use the present perfect. So if you're B1, present perfect might be new to you. If you're B2, it probably isn't, okay? So if you're B2, you probably know past simple, present perfect, okay? You know when to use both. Maybe you get confused sometimes, but you've at least heard of these 2 things. So I'm going to introduce something new, which is the past perfect. And I have here an example sentence. I had been to Bender before I moved to Pridnestrovia. Okay? I had been to Bender before I moved to Pridnestrovia. Okay? So when we use this, we're using 2 different verbs. Okay? And our first verb is the actual past perfect. I had been. And it looks kind of like the present perfect. I have been, because they both use the perfect tense, or the participle, which is been. They do not both use the same time tense, okay? They have is different from had. Have is present, like present perfect. Had is past tense, like in past perfect. So we're saying I had been to Bender before. I had been to Bender before I moved to Pridnestrovia. Okay? I had been to Bender before I moved to Pridnestrovia. Both of these tenses are in the past. However, The first one is in the way past. The second is just in the past, okay? So we're talking about two things that both happened before now, but one happened before the other. And it will say that in the sentence. It will say what happened first, because it says, I had been to Bender before I moved to Pridnestrovia. I had been to Bender before I moved to Pridnestrovia. So that's how we know that I traveled to Bender first. That was the first thing that happened. And then second, I moved to Pridnestrovia. I went to Bender, I visited, I looked around, I said, this is nice. And then I decided to move there. That was the second thing that happened. Okay? So here we've got a better explanation of these grammar rules. So to recap, we say in past simple, we're saying exactly when something happened. Yesterday, I went to Bender. Yesterday, I went to the mall. Last week, I traveled to Ukraine. Last year, I traveled to France. Okay? These are past simple because we know when it happened. We know when. We use present perfect when we don't know or we don't want to say. We don't want other people to know when it happened, or we don't want to explain. Okay? So, I have been to Bender. I have been to France. I have traveled to Iceland. I'm not telling you when. I'm telling you that I have traveled to these places. Okay? These are just my life experiences. I'm telling you about my life. Okay? I don't want to tell you when. I don't want to tell how many times. I just want to tell you, oh, I've been there before. Okay? With this tense, when it talks about being present perfect, the grammar is in the present, but it still talks about the past. That's one thing that we have to make sure we know. When we use the present perfect, it says that it's present, but we're not really talking about the present. We're talking about the past. We're talking about our life experiences, things that we did before. Last week, last month, last year, could be any time. Okay, but it is the past. It is not the present. And finally, we talked about the past perfect, which is the new concept for today. We show an action, okay, with the past perfect. We show an action with the past perfect that happened before a later action, which we use in the past simple, okay? So when we said I had been to Bender before I moved to Pridnestrovia, we've got had been. Had been is our past perfect. And moved, I moved to Pridnestrovia, that is going to be in the past simple tense. The past simple tense. Because we know when it happened. Okay? When did it happen? Oh, well, it happened after I had been to Bender. Okay? So we're not talking about the exact specific time in the past simple that I did that, but we are talking about when it happened. It happened, we know it happened before now. We know it happened after I had been to Bender. Okay? So that's specific enough to use the past simple. Okay? So we've got another example sentence here. I had been to every continent before I went to China. So you can see here I underlined which tense is which. I had been is past perfect. I went to China, that's past simple. Okay? So now we're going to talk a little bit more about me. Okay? We're going to talk a little bit more about my travels. Okay? Like I said, every pin is a place that I have traveled to. And so you could ask me using the past simple. Okay? Where did you go last year? And I could tell you, oh, last year I went to Pridnestrovia. I went to Ukraine. I went to Jordan. I went to Iraq. Okay? I went to these places last year. Okay? So I'm being specific. So I'm using the past simple. If you asked me, where have you been? Where have you been? Or, where have you been in Africa? Okay? You're asking me about my life experience. You're not asking me a specific time. You're asking me, where have you been in Africa? Okay? And I can answer you. If I didn't tell you when, I would say, well, I have been to Algeria. I have been to South Africa. I have traveled to Ethiopia. I have flown, if we want to get crazy and get adventurous with our perfect verbs. We could say have flown, which is the participle of fly. I have flown, past tense would be flew, to Ethiopia or to Djibouti. Okay. I drove, well, of course, I didn't drive to Africa because it's surrounded by water, but you get the point, right? We could say I have driven to Canada, okay? Because I live in Connecticut, which is close to New York, and it's only a few hours, 3, 4, maybe 5 hours if the traffic is bad, if I want to drive to Canada, okay? So I could say I have driven to Canada, or last year I drove to Canada, if I wanted to be more specific. Okay, so that's our review of the past simple and present perfect. So now let's talk a little bit more about the past perfect. Okay, using the past perfect to talk about places that you've traveled. You know, if you're a tourist, like me, I like to travel, I like to go places. You like to remember when you went to places, and you like to put them in order. Okay, so if somebody asks you, have you been to Ukraine? Okay, using the present perfect. Have you been to Ukraine? You might say, yes, I have been to Ukraine. And then if someone says to you, have you been to Moldova? You'd say, yes, I have been to Moldova. And if somebody asks you, when did you go to those places? Or which place did you go to first? Or which place did you go to second? You could say, well, I had been to Ukraine before I went to Moldova, or I had been to Moldova before I went to Ukraine, okay? So we're putting these things in order. What was the first thing that happened? Well, first, I'd been to Ukraine, okay? I'd been to Ukraine many, many times. I'd been to Ukraine so many times. Who knows, right? I don't want to say how many times or when or how long ago. But I do want to say that it happened before I went to Moldova. So I had been to Ukraine before, but then I went to Moldova, okay? Have you been to Ukraine or Moldova? Where did you go first? Well, I'd been to Ukraine many times before I went to Moldova, okay? So let's say I'm from Ukraine. Let's say I was born in Kiev, okay? And I'd gone many, many times to Ukraine. If somebody asked me, I'd say, "Oh, I've been to Kiev. I had been to Ukraine before I went to Moldova." So we're putting these things in order. Okay. So let's look back at my map. Okay. We've got many, many countries on this map. Many, many countries. Okay. We've got Iceland. We've got the United States. We've got all over South America. I've traveled to. Okay. And I'm going to give you just a few example sentences, and you can tell me which ones happened first and which ones happened second. If I say, I had flown to China before I flew to Russia, which happened first? China, right? I went to China first. I had flown to China before I flew to Russia. Had flown, past participle. Flew, past simple. Okay. I had traveled to South America before I went to Spain. Okay. I had traveled to South America before I went to Spain. Okay. Which one of those is in the past participle? I had traveled to South America, had traveled. And then what's the past symbol? I went to Spain. Okay. Now, here we have it in a certain order. We say I had been, we have past perfect first, and then we use past simple. That doesn't have to be the case. We can flip it around. There's no problem with that. If we say I moved to Pridnestrovia before I had been to Bender, or the opposite, I moved to Pridnestrovia after I had been to Bender, both are grammatically correct. They mean different things because they're different orders, but you can say it both ways. So I could say I went to Spain before I had been to South America. That's okay. I went to Iceland before I had traveled to Eastern Europe. That's okay too. Okay? It's all grammatically correct. It doesn't matter the order. Okay? So I hope you liked this lesson. It went a little bit longer than I expected, but I wanted to introduce you to a few concepts. One that I hope you've mastered, both B1 and B2. I hope you've mastered the past simple. Present perfect, if you're B1, you probably are new to present perfect. If you're B2, you're probably somewhat comfortable with present perfect. And then I wanted to give you something new. I wanted to give you the past perfect, which B1 and B2 you probably aren't too familiar with, or this is a very new concept to you. And I also wanted to introduce you to some parts of the world that you might want to travel to one day, okay? And talking about putting things in order, using travel words to travel, to fly, to go, using these words in a way that's talking about being a tourist, being a person who travels. So it's great meeting you.